of programs for the entire family featuring many of the world's leading creationist speakers. They will answer your questions about creation and evolution and will demonstrate that the book of Genesis is reliable and vitally important.
Just one last thing concerning day 3 that I'd like to say is that life first appeared on the land according to the Bible. According to evolution, life first appeared in the sea. And for those people that say that the order of events according to evolution and the Bible are the same, all you need to do is sit down and list the order of events according to evolution, and depending upon which textbook you read will depend upon which order you get sometimes, and list the order of events according to the Bible, and you'll find they are very, very different. And this particular overhead here actually lines some of them up to show you that they are different. I don't want to go through that in detail, but just to mention to you that the order of events cannot be reconciled at all. If we move on to day 4, on day 4 God made the sun, the moon and the stars. Here we have another why of creation. For signs and for seasons He made them. In fact, we could just talk about that for an hour or so if we really wanted to. For signs and for seasons He made the sun to be the light holder. From that time onwards, the sun didn't exist until day 4, even though there was light up until that time. But I'll just answer one particular question we often get in relation to this. So in relation to the stars, people often say to us, well, light from the furthest star takes millions of years to get here. We know how fast light travels, therefore the universe must be millions of years old. And that does seem to be a perplexing one. But once again, it might not necessarily mean that things are millions of years old. It could just mean we don't know all the evidence to know how to explain that. There could be an explanation we've never thought of. I'd like to give you a possible explanation we've never thought of. I'm not saying it's fact or anything like that, but it is a good example to show you how somebody can come up with an idea you never thought possible, which can explain such things. Now, a man in South Australia called Barry Setterfield has looked at the measurements of speed of light since 1675, and one of the things he's noticed is that they've shown a decrease. In fact, for those that are familiar with this particular research, he'll have a new monograph produced very shortly, and he has found some other astounding measurements made, in fact, very recently, and he's got some many other astounding things to tell us, and it's going to be rather exciting. And he's got a lot more information to substantiate this particular theory than he ever had before, but I can't release that to you at the moment until he gets it published. But basically, to summarise it all, what he's suggesting is that when you put all these measurements into a computer and you graph them, it indicates that light has slowed down, that light's speed is not a constant. And in fact, if you solve the equation here for time, it comes to about 6,000 years. In other words, it started slowing down about 6,000 years ago, which is interesting because that would be about the age that I'd place on the earth anyway, from what I understand from the scripture. Light then was 5 times 10 to the 11th faster than it is now, which means it was almost infinite in speed. So when God said, let there be light, there it was, infinitely travelling through space, which means light from the furthest star, when the stars were created, would have reached Earth almost instantaneously. Now, that particular theory explains a lot of other things too. In fact, the speed of light would affect many, many aspects of our world. The speed of light, for instance, is related to radioactive decay. If the speed of light was faster in the past, so would have radioactive decay, and so that would squash all your millions of years. You sometimes get some radioactive measurements down to thousands of years. It has great number of implications. Now, even if that was wrong, and there are other possible explanations too, but even if that was wrong, it still should show us that oftentimes when we think something contradicts the Bible, there could be an explanation we've never thought of. And by the way, he has got some startling information to substantiate more and more some of the research that he's done. And I'd encourage you to be on the lookout for that. Make sure you get on our mailing list so that we can tell you when that particular monograph comes available, which hopefully will be fairly soon. On day 5, the Bible tells us God created the sea creatures and the birds. The sea creatures and the birds. Just mention one thing here because I want to do day 5 and 6 together. On day 6, the land animals and man. Just recently I was in San Diego. I went to SeaWorld, and there was one particular place where they have some beautiful displays, marine aquaria with the marine creatures in them, And as I walked along and looked at each aquarium, and that there's tremendous display there, and looked at the enormous beauty that I see there, and the variation, the enormous number of kinds and so on, the only thing I could do was to stand back and say, wow, how infinite God is. When He made all those things in one day. And I only saw just a glimpse of it. And as Gary said yesterday, if you saw the world before Noah's flood compared to after Noah's flood, and there were so many more of those creatures in the sea. And one of the things I thought about too, and Gary might even like to comment on this, but as I looked at the sea creatures, some of them showed such exquisite beauty, to me even more so than many of the land animals. And I wondered whether, because they were in the sea and therefore protected much more than the land animals from some of the harsh environment of the cosmic radiation and so on, perhaps they haven't been affected by the curse, so to speak, as much as some of the land animals, which is why you see such exquisite beauty amongst some of these creatures of the sea. And it was tremendous just to walk along there and to think about God as infinite and infinite power and the way that He made those sea creatures, and you just felt like worshipping God and praising the God of creation. On day 6, we're told that God made the land animals and man. He made the first two people, Adam and Eve. If He made land animals and man, the dinosaurs are land animals, and as we said in the second lecture, I think it was, or the first lecture, dinosaur and man would have lived at the same time. And you know, there's a lot of evidence consistent with dinosaur and man living at the same time. A lot of evidence. You've heard of dragon legends? You know, many of your dragon legends, when you actually go and look at them, and perhaps they are stories of people's encounters with beasts of the past, when you actually look at some of the descriptions that are given, they do fit some of the dinosaurs. Quite incredibly so. And we need to recognise too that the naturalists of the past, 17th, 18th century, when they used to describe some of the animals that lived and drew their descriptions in books and diagrams and were very careful about their observations, some of what we see looks exactly like some of the dinosaurs that we find only as fossils, and they got their descriptions from animals that were living at that time. There is a lot of evidence consistent with dinosaurs, some of them at least, living right up until the present time. And as I said to you, we don't know dinosaurs are extinct anyway. We might believe they are because we haven't seen them for a while. Although there are some people today who believe that in some of the remote jungles there are some beasts that live there that perhaps could be dinosaurs. Of course, if the evolutionists find any dinosaur living today, they'll say this is tremendous. Here we have in this particular jungle evolutionary time that's been tracked for millions of years to enable these organisms to continue to exist. But you know what they do when they find an organism that should have died millions of years ago and they find it living today, don't you? They call it a living fossil. And the word living fossil means, hi folks, this animal shouldn't be here, but it is. And so we give it the term living fossil. It actually became extinct millions of years ago, but we suddenly found it alive today. You might be interested to know that it wasn't too many years ago that a Japanese fishing trawler off the coast of New Zealand pulled up a carcass of an animal in its nets, and they got the shock of their lives. It looked exactly like a plesiosaurus. And that shouldn't have been there. There are many other sightings of things similar to plesiosaurs around the world. We don't hear about these things very often in the news because it so contradicts evolution that we can't be told about them. The intriguing thing is, you know, if you go to the library and look up a lot of research papers and other books, there are all sorts of things we find that do contradict evolution, but you're never told about them. For instance, how many of you have been told that when we had this big explosion at Mount St Helens, that one of the mud flows produced an enormous canyon in only a few days and left a little stream at the bottom, sort of looks like a mini Grand Canyon, that normally when we look at those things, evolutionists tell us it took millions of years. Now those things don't get blasted across the news, do they? Because it contradicts what we've been told. How many of you would have been told that there are many caves in the world, limestone caves, where we found that the stalactites grow very rapidly and can be explained within a few years or a few hundreds of years? We're not told those sorts of things. I remember when I went up to Darwin, I went down to Katherine, was going through the limestone cave there. There was a couple of intriguing things happened. One was the guide told us in this particular cave where it's pitch black, there's a species of prawn that has evolved the ability not to see. and it's actually lost its eyes. And what a tremendous evolutionary progression this is, to be able to lose your eyes and to be able to live in such a black environment. And he was telling us that this species of prawn only lives at one other place in the world. Of course, when you think about it, the fact that some of these could be born without eyes, the best place that they could survive is in a black environment where the other things can't see either to eat them. Right? There's a totally different explanation. He's trying to say that that's evolutionary advancement, to lose your eyes. Well, I should have asked him whether he'd like to have that advancement, I guess, and go from there. But he also said how these stalactites, because the Katherine Caves there are such a dry cave, they only have water in them once a year, it took millions of years to form the stalactites. Now, a lot of other caves, you'd be told, hundreds of thousands of years, but this one, it was millions of years. And then he went into one cave and he explained how the Vandals got in here about 100 years ago, and they used rifles to shoot many of the stalactites in this particular cavern, and you could see where they were all broken off and what a shame it was. And he was ready to go on to the next cavern, and I said, they're the ones that they shot off up there? Yes, that's true, he said. I said, but, so that's that flat area you can see, yes? But I said on many of them you can see regrowth up to 6 or 9 inches. That's slightly smaller in diameter. And I said, doesn't that mean it mustn't have taken millions of years? And he looked at that and he didn't know what to say at all. And very quickly moved on to the next cavern. So often the observations you see just don't fit with what we've been told. And again, the same comes with things like dinosaurs. When you actually start to research it, the observations that we find, the information that we find just don't fit with what the evolutionists have said. And as I said in the first lecture, remember when you dig up fossils of dinosaurs, you're not digging up the remains of dinosaurs millions of years ago, you're not digging up an age of the dinosaurs, you're digging up dead dinosaurs that exist today. Well, how did those dead dinosaurs get there? Well, if death came after Adam sinned, fossils couldn't have formed before Adam, there must be an explanation for fossils sometime after Adam sinned. And as we read on in the Bible, it tells us about this event called Noah's flood. It says the world was covered with water, and water destroyed the earth. It says 2 of every kind of animal, 7 of some went on board Noah's ark. By the way, I hope none of you are like some of the students I meet in high schools. They put up their hand, "Aye, sir." That can't be true. Couldn't have happened. Why not, son? There's no way Noah could have fitted all them animals in the ark, eh? How many animals did he need to fit in there, son? Don't know, sir, but it couldn't have happened, could it, eh? Well, tell me, son, what size was the ark? I don't know, sir, but there's no way it could have happened, eh? Yeah. Now, there's a student who's typical of our education system and his mathematics. An unknown number of animals can't fit in an unknown size ark, so the whole thing's a fairy tale. You know, it's even worse when they put their hands up and say, "Hey, sir, there's no way Moses could have fitted them animals in the ark, eh?" Sort of tells you something about where they're at. Again, going back to how we build our models of science, we say, okay, if there was a worldwide flood, and by the way, it wasn't a backup of the Suma Creek, as some theologians tell us, it was a worldwide flood. In fact, the Bible says that God put a rainbow in the sky as a covenant between God and the animals and God and man, as a covenant, something which can't be broken because God has given a promise that he would never send such a flood again. Now look around us. Do we see lots of floods? We do. Has God broken his promise? No, because he hasn't repeated a worldwide flood. And that's the difference. He hasn't repeated a worldwide flood. So if there was this worldwide flood, what would have happened to all the animals outside of the ark? They would have drowned. Many buried in sediments. In fact, water would have ripped up billions of tons of sediment. You know, if you've ever even seen local floods, you'll know that water can do incredible things. Things that we never ever thought possible. Incredible things. You know, at Mount St. Helens, when that volcano erupted, the force of the steam and ash and such things forced one of the lakes, the entire body of water of the lake, to wash up the side of a mountain and rip out every tree in that area and gouge out a big section of that mountain and wash back into the lake. Now, when the Bible talks about fountains of the deep breaking up, enormous volcanic action, and water over the earth, if you've ever seen some of the pictures overseas of some of the dams that have broken, and some of the incredible mud flows that can occur, and they're just little catastrophes. You imagine a worldwide catastrophe, and water sorts things into layers. It would have been an incredible cataclysmic event. And if you've got water ripping around the Earth's surface for approximately a year, and it would have been sorting things into layers, animals and plants would have been ripped up and buried, you'd probably expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the Earth, as we said. And you know, that's exactly what you do find. But the way we work is this: if Noah's flood was true, what would we expect to find? Let's go out and have a look, and let's see if the evidence fits with what we're saying. And I believe it does. But if you think about fossil formation, you know, how does a fossil form anyway? You can do an experiment right here at this college. Get a cow, shoot it, put it in the backyard there, and then watch it for a few months. Take notes every day. Okay? Now, will it turn into a fossil? No, it won't, will it? It won't, because you have to cover things very quickly. When you think of the prairies in America where they shot virtually millions of buffalo, go there today, you don't find millions of fossils of buffalo. You see, to form a fossil you have to cover something quickly. I remember at school I was always taught any fossil formation is a catastrophic event. You have to cover something quickly to preserve it. It's a catastrophic event to form a fossil. And then in the next chapter they told me, and the fossil record formed slowly over millions of years. Now, I never could put those two things together. But let's consider for a moment fossil fish. Now, that's from Kansas, actually, a Kansas museum. If you studied science at school, you'll recall in your textbooks, in fact, not only is it in your textbooks, you'll find it in books like the Time Life book on fishes, or when I was in the Minneapolis Museum in Minnesota, they actually had these diagrams drawn by the museum staff to show you how fish fossils formed. And this is what we're told. Fish die, they sink to the bottom, slowly covered by sediments, and over millions of years you get your layers of fish fossils. And you often see in the textbooks these diagrams with a fish up here, fish dies, sink to the bottom, covered by sediment, and so on. Except when fish die, they usually sink or float. They usually float, don't they? If you don't believe me, drop some cyanide in your neighbour's aquarium, see what happens. And you'll find that they float. Only a few sink, and only under special circumstances, really. Now, you'll know too that if you have an aquarium, that fish rot very quickly, eaten by other fish very quickly, and their remains will drip to the bottom and so on. But to form a fossil fish, like in California where you've got a 6-inch layer over 4 square miles, an estimated 6 billion fossilised fish, whatever happened had to be fairly quick, had to be fairly rapid, didn't it? When you think of the world, and this is one of the things that you can't grasp unless you get your little shovels and get out there and start digging it up. You see a few fossils in textbooks, and most school students think, oh yeah, there's a few fossils around the world. There are billions and billions and billions and billions and billions more we don't know about, and billions more we'll never know about, and billions more we don't even know to question about. In other words, there's enormous quantities of fossils, enormous layers of rocks around the world laid down by water. It's incredible. And that's why the evolutionist says it must have taken millions and millions of years. But when you look at it, it's obvious that there had to be enormous catastrophe associated with it. See, this fish here had swallowed another fish. You notice something about the fish inside, it hasn't digested at all. That had to be quick, didn't it? Because the evolutionist story is this fish swallowed this one, choked on it, sank to the bottom and got covered by sediment, and it doesn't make any sense, does it? But, okay, well, what about your dinosaur fossils then? Well, first of all, if Noah's Ark's true, and the Bible says 2 of every kind of animal went on board Noah's Ark, does every mean all or some? All. So did the dinosaurs go on board the Ark? Yes. You know, here's something intriguing. When I'm teaching even in Christian schools, I say this to the kids. If 2 of every kind of animal went on board Noah's Ark, and every means all, did all the types of animals go on the Ark? Yes, sir. Does that mean the dinosaurs went on the Ark? No, sir. Let me say it again. If 2 of every kind of animal went on the Ark, and every means all, does all mean all the types of animals? Yes, sir. Did the dinosaurs go on the Ark? No, sir. You know why they say that? Because their minds are so permeated with the teaching of evolution from the TV. Dinosaurs were prehistoric monsters that lived millions of years ago. It's got nothing to do with Noah's Ark. And it takes a lot of work to get them to rethink that. But if the Bible's true, that's the picture. Dinosaurs, koala bears, kangaroos, all went on board Noah's Ark. Now, what happened to those that didn't go on board the Ark? And by the way, you'll often see the evolutionists saying, yeah, and how did Noah get over to Africa and Australia and get the kangaroos and bring them all back, and what did he do? Have to get another boat and ship them over and this sort of thing? and he had to collect them all. The Bible says God brought the animals to Noah. And the Bible also indicates that when the earth was first made, it says the waters were gathered together into one place, and therefore logically it would seem the land was in one place. And when they talk about continental drift and the continents splitting up over millions of years, I suggest to you that the continental drift that has occurred, the ripping apart of the continent into the various continents we have today, probably occurred at the end of Noah's flood. And one of the reasons we can say that is because you do find sedimentary layers on the continents that look very similar, indicating that those layers were laid down first and then the thing has split apart. And it would seem at the end of the flood, possibly when, as it says in Psalm 104, the mountains rose. There were great catastrophic processes. The valleys sank, the ocean basins formed, the water poured off the earth, gouging out great canyons, like for instance the Grand Canyon. That as that was happening, perhaps the continents were then splitting up to what we have today. Now, what happened to those animals that didn't go on board the ark? They drowned, including the dinosaurs. And when you dig up dinosaur fossils, what are you digging up? I believe you're digging up nothing more than the remains of those dinosaurs that were killed at the time of Noah's flood. Now let me also say something here. I am not saying all the fossils formed at the time of the flood, because after Noah's flood there would have been lots of local catastrophes as things were still settling down, still volcanic eruptions, local flooding, all sorts of things. And it's interesting, in Australia people often ask, why do you only find kangaroo fossils and fossils of some of the Australian native animals here in Australia? In fact, they are now finding certain fossils of marsupials in other parts of the world, and I wouldn't be surprised if they eventually turned up a kangaroo fossil somewhere else. But one of the reasons you only find them at the moment in Australia is because I believe what you're finding is a post-flood deposit. The interesting thing is, the unique animals in Australia, their fossils are always in the top layers. So I believe it was something that happened after the flood. Now, when Noah's Ark landed, what happened to the animals? They got out of the Ark. How did the kangaroo get to Australia? Obviously hopped, that's right. And some people say, but how do we explain that? Well, the Aborigines tell us that they came down through the north. And you know, the ocean up there between Australia and Indonesia is very shallow, isn't it? Now, it's possible there was a land bridge there. The Aborigines believe there was. They say that's how they got here. And they say they brought the dingo. Assuming there was a land bridge there, and the Aborigines came down there, the marsupials, like your kangaroos and others, that probably didn't compete very well with other animals in other parts of the world, get pushed out, and they get to Australia. If then the land bridge either sinks or there's flooding because some of the ice after Noah's flood started to melt and the ocean levels rose again a little bit, then they were cut off in Australia and able to survive quite happily without competition from a lot of other animals. The reason that you don't find fossils in other areas is probably like the buffalo. They decayed, and so you don't find their remains. In other words, again, what I'm saying to you is when you take the Bible as your basis and you go and look for logical explanations, you can find that the evidence does fit. One of the interesting things is that in Australia we have a very large variety of parrots. And when you think about Noah's Ark, as the birds got off that boat in the Middle East, the further away they would get from Noah's Ark, and you see birds wouldn't have the same boundaries that land animals have. They could cross mountains and rivers quite easily. The further away they get from the Middle East, you'd expect more and more variety. As they moved into different environments and due to the variation within a kind that we talked about, you'd expect more and more species of these things the further they move out. And you know, that's exactly what we find. In fact, we find there's a radial distribution in regard to, say, parrots centred around the Middle East, and the further away you get from the Middle East, the more varieties there are. And that fits exactly with what we'd expect on the basis of Noah's Ark. So again, what I'm saying to you is when you take that as your basis, take what the Bible says and look at the evidence, it all fits. Now, of course, the evolutionist, he has this belief in what's called uniformitarianism. Sediments form basically slowly today, so it must have taken millions of years to form all these sediments. And therefore, their scientific model is this, that you see in textbooks, a geological timescale, all these layers one on top of the other. These are the first ones, these are the last ones here, or the latest ones. And the fact that you find simple, supposedly, into complex, and you find the order of evolution in the rocks, therefore, it's obvious life evolved. The interesting thing, of course, that I never realised even when I went through university, you don't go to a place and dig down and find all these layers one on top of the other. You find an assortment of layers across the earth, And what they've done is this. They believe that this is how evolution occurred in this order that's represented by these pictures of animals here. Therefore, when they find rocks with these fossils in them there on the bottom, rocks, you know, with fossils of dinosaurs, they go here. Rocks with these fossils here, they go here. And so they arrange it in the textbook and they say, here, that proves evolution. But you see what they've done? They've started with the story of evolution and arranged what you find. Now, you do find sometimes a number of these layers one on top of the other, but you don't find often very many of those layers one on top of the other. Often you find layers repeated, often you find them in the wrong order, and often you find fossils in layers that shouldn't be there. Now, you often don't read about those sorts of things either, because it contradicts evolution. There is a sort of an order in the fossil record, and you'd expect a sort of an order, because animals would have been in different ecological zones, whether it be on the land or in the ocean. Also, because of the sorting processes of water, you would expect a sort of an order in the fossil record. And that's what you find. But you also find lots of exceptions. Now, see, the evolutionist view of life cannot cope with any exceptions. The creationist view can. Because when we understand our model of the flood, we'd expect order plus lots of exceptions due to local conditions, varying conditions. Whereas the evolutionist, you've only got to find dinosaurs in the wrong layer, they've got an immediate problem. Or you've got to find trilobites in the wrong layer, they've got an immediate problem. And there are lots of exceptions, and the more we've looked at it, the more we find the exceptions. And evolutionists find that very hard to cope with. After Noah's flood, I might just mention one other thing here too. Not only would you find animal fossils, but you also should find lots and lots of plant fossils. And somebody said human. Maybe I could mention for you just some research we're doing at the moment. There are many human fossils around the world. In fact, I would say this to you, there is evidence of human remains, human fossils, or footprints or whatever at almost every level of that geological column, in almost every layer. But we're doing some interesting research at the moment. In fact, in our technical journal, which is going to be released in a couple of months' time, the latest on this will be issued, but over in the island of Guadeloupe in the Caribbean, there's a deposit containing human fossils, and one was taken over to the British Museum and one was taken over to Paris many years ago, in the 1800s I think it was. But the problem with that is that the layer that these human fossils are in, and the original research done on this suggests there are possibly hundreds of human fossils there, and they're very contorted and so on. But the layer they're in is supposed to be about 25 million years old, but man didn't evolve for another 23 million years later. Now, the British Museum and ourselves at the moment are looking at this very carefully, because they said, well, this is obviously beach rock, and it's not Miocene rock at all. It's not millions of years old. And so John Mackay recently went to Guadeloupe and did a lot of research and has come back, and it seems as if that the beach rock is associated with other areas. They then said, well, these are the Indian graves. Well, John found the Indian graves, and the Indian graves are in a totally different area to where these fossils came from, and it looks like the evolutionists might have a big problem. So we're continuing to research that. But see, these sorts of things you never read about either, because it totally contradicts with evolution. But in regard to plant fossils, if you had a beautiful world, it had a canopy, your trees would have grown to a much greater extent, the water would have ripped up possibly millions of trees. It would have ripped up possibly millions of plants of all sorts. Not only would you therefore expect to find animal dumps around the world, you'd expect to find plant dumps. Well, is there anywhere in the world you can find enormous quantities of remains of plants, like you do animals? The answer is yes, only we call it coal. Now, of course, when I went to school, I was told coal formed in swamps over millions of years. As the material grew in the swamp, it fell in and so on, you get your layers of fossil material, and that's how the coal formed. But you know what we've discovered? There is no evidence anywhere in the world that coal forms in swamps. Absolutely none. Let me give you a couple of examples. These are going to be hard to see because we're not using proper slides. But this is a coal deposit in Victoria, down there in Morwell, your lawn area. This coal deposit's about 1,000 feet thick, and the coal sequences are over about 1,000 square kilometres, as I understand it. You imagine a 1,000-foot thick coal seam, and it sits on white clay. Okay? Now, we went down there, and if you go to the visitor centre, it'll tell you this is a swamp 12 to 30 million years ago, and as the material grew in the swamp, you eventually get this enormous coal seam, 1,000 feet thick. In fact, that's called brown coal, and it looks just like that. That's a piece of Anthrotaxis saliginoides, which means pine tree. And you can have a look at that. It just looks like a piece of wood you'd find in the bush, and that's all brown coal is. So just put it there, and you've got 1,000 feet of that stuff. You've got trees up to 9 foot in diameter going at all sorts of angles and bits of branches and so on. So we went to one of the geologists there and we said, well, we believe this coal could have been a product of Noah's flood, water washing in plant material and dumping it catastrophically. Well, he said a few interesting things when we said that. But he said to us, no, this was a swamp 12 to 30 million years ago. We said, but most of the trees have been identified. Most of them are pine trees. Yes, that's true, he said. We said, but pine trees don't grow in swamps. No, he said, that is a little bit of a problem. But he said, perhaps pine trees grew differently in the past. Right? That sort of sounds like, well, we don't have any in-between forms, so it happened so fast we missed it. You know what I mean? We have to make up an additional theory to explain why our other theory doesn't work, which means with evolution you can never lose, can you? It's true anyway, they say, therefore we will make up a theory regardless. Now, the interesting thing is you can see those pine trees growing in Tasmania today, and they grow on the hillsides. King Billy pines, celery top pines, they don't like getting their feet wet at all. You ever seen a pine tree swamp? Doesn't make sense, does it? And the other thing is it sits on white clay. Where's the soil from the swamp? Evidence of burrowing animals, evidence of the mud, evidence of the roots growing in the soil and so on. You know what they said? Well, they've got this theory that all the soil's been washed out and white clay's been washed underneath to replace it. Underneath a 1,000-foot coal seam over a big area. That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Doesn't make any sense at all. You know, many geologists agree that we've got to look at coal formations as a result of catastrophic processes. In fact, you know, we can make high-grade black coal in a laboratory now in a matter of weeks. You can turn a pine tree into high-grade black coal in a laboratory in a matter of a year or so. What they found, it's not heat and pressure that's involved so much, but it's heat and clay. Because certain clays act as a catalyst and can convert your brown coal into black coal, or convert woody material into black coal. It doesn't take millions of years. It doesn't take millions of years to turn or to make oil. Remember we were told sea creatures that were buried over millions of years you get oil? You know, in Bass Strait, where they mine Bass Strait for oil, the scientists have found the oil forms now while you're sitting here, bubbling off the material like coal that's there. And in fact, you can make oil in a matter of minutes in a laboratory. It doesn't take long. And there are some countries, some of those that have oil embargoes and so on, they can make their own oil, can't they? Just using plant material, certain kinds of trash and so on. Again, a lot of what we were told, when you actually go out and observe, the evidence doesn't fit. I remember being in Collie in West Australia. You know where that is? Over that way? And over there they have coal seams. You have layers of coal sort of in a basin, and in between you have sandstone and shale. So it goes coal, sandstone, shale, coal, sandstone, shale, coal, and so on. And the bands of sandstone and shale are very similar to the bands of coal, just look like bands of rock. And we said to one of the geologists, how did the coal get there? Well, he said, theory is it was a swamp millions of years ago. We said, how did the sandstone and shale get there? Oh, easy, he said, the water washed in the material quite rapidly. We said, well, how do you know the coal was a swamp? He said, oh, that's easy because it's got swamp plants in it. It's got, you know, I can't even think of the name of them, but Glossopteris and Gangamopteris, that's right. It's got Glossopteris and Gangamopteris. Now you all know that, don't you? Yes. And we said, why does that make it a swamp? He said, because they're swamp plants. Now you've got to keep in mind that Glossopteris and Gangamopteris we only ever find as fossil plants. We only ever find their leaves, and we've never found them connected to their roots. Okay, we've never seen them living today. So why is it a swamp? Because it's got swamp plants in it. It's got Glossopteris and Gangamopteris. How do you know they're swamp plants? He said, that's easy because you find them in coal. Circular reasoning. Once again, we said to him, where's the soil from the swamp? Strange thing, he said, there's no soil. You know, we asked the geologist, is there any reason why the coal couldn't be just like the other layers there, material washed in by water in bands and it's turned into coal? He said, well, to be honest, the evidence is consistent with that. But he said, theory is it was a swamp. Again, I'd like to suggest to you that when you look at the evidence, such as coal, it fits with what we'd expect from Noah's flood. In fact, all over the world, we have enormous evidence of a catastrophic judgment. so catastrophic it's staring us in the face. God has judged this world, let it be a warning to you, he's going to judge again. As in the days of Noah, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. I've judged this world once with water, says the Lord. That should be a warning to every one of you. I'm going to judge it again, but next time by fire, and that'll be the final judgment. And as I said in one of the previous programs, the reason geologists don't want to believe in a worldwide flood is not because the evidence doesn't support it, it's because it agrees with the Bible, and therefore it means they have to be obedient to the God of creation, that they can't be a law unto themselves. They're not just autonomous man, that God owns them. And that is really what it comes down to. After Noah's flood, we're told 8 people got off the ark. They increased in numbers. Eventually they congregated together to build a tower called the Tower of Babel. That they disobeyed the Lord, so the Lord came and gave them different languages. And you can imagine as a result of this, they would have split up and gone to different places on the earth's surface, developing different cultures. And following on from what Gary said in one of his lectures, they would have taken certain variations of the genes with them, which means you get a predominance of certain characteristics in certain areas dependent upon which part of the gene pool they took with them. And the same goes for such things as skin colour. We know there's only one colour because you have the one pigment, melanin, and you can have a light shade or a dark shade, and dependent upon which genes you took with you, some would only produce the very dark shade generation after generation, some would produce a light shade, some could produce a whole range, just dependent upon what genes they took with them. This means that all cultures of the world today can be traced back to the Tower of Babel, back to Noah, back to Adam. Is there any evidence consistent with this? There's enormous evidence. You know, we've had a lot of people who've worked with the Australian Aborigines, and they collected many of the legends the Australian Aborigines have, and they had these legends about their history, their Dreamtime legends, before they met the white missionary. And let me just, in a very summarised form, tell you briefly some of these legends and think about where you've heard similar stories. They go something like this. Najara, the Supreme Being, looked down on the man he had made, and he was angry with Gajara for the way he treated Dumby the Winking Owl. So he warned Gajara he was going to send a flood, and he was to build a raft and want to put the cockatoo and kangaroo and ground meal for food, and the raft landed on a mountain. And the man sacrificed a kangaroo to the god, and God put a rainbow in the sky to tell them what the weather would be like. Heard a story something similar to that? Some of the Eastern Aborigines say their ancestors were 3 sons that arrived in Australia on a boat after a flood. The army, the creator spirit, looked down on the man he had made, and he was sad for the man because he was all alone. And the man looked at all the animals and he couldn't find a mate, and the animals were sad for man because he was alone. So while the man slept out of the nearest yucca tree, God made a woman for him. Heard a story like that? When Biami made man and animals, they only ate vegetables. There was no death in the world, and Biami had a special tree. And he warned man not to eat the sweet honey out of his special tree, but man did. And Biami got angry and he cursed the world with death, and the animals started eating each other. But until that time, there was no death in the world. Heard a story like that? Do you know it's not only the Australian Aborigines that have stories like that? Do you know who else do? The Indians. The American Indians abound with stories like that. The Fijians, the Eskimos, the Hawaiians. Look, the Maoris. All around the world, you find nearly every culture of the world abounds with stories like that. Even in things like some of the Chinese characters, if you actually look at them and look at people who've written about them, to show you that the word for flood and the way that it's drawn, obviously it reflects the story of Noah, and so it goes on. You see these things all around the world. You know, that is just overwhelming evidence to fit with the biblical history of things. In fact, I think it's exciting and very humbling too, because as you see that sort of thing, you say, you know, the Bible really is God's word. It really is true. And the evidence all fits. You might have heard of the Babylonian legends. There's one legend called the Lady of the Rib. Interesting, isn't it? Now, when I went to school, I was told the reason that the Babylonians have similar stories to the Jews is because the Jews obviously borrowed the stories from the Babylonians. Now, if you read the stories of the Babylonians, you find gods cutting each other in half and water spewing out, and they're rather grotesque and totally unbelievable. Let's be honest, which is the most believable version? The Bible. And you know that stories, if they're handed down by word of mouth, for instance, and they're not carefully preserved, they don't get better, they get worse. So even from that angle, you compare the Babylonian stories to the Bible, you know which must have come from which. The Jews didn't borrow theirs from the Babylonians, they got theirs from the true record that's been preserved and handed down very, very carefully, generation after generation. And we have it here in the Bible. And that's the true record of creation. You know, all the evidence fits. And yet so many millions of people are being led astray. And led astray by this evil philosophy called evolution. What I'm trying to tell you over and over again is this. What we read in the Bible is history. We have the written word. We have oral traditions. We have witnesses who are present. It's all here for us. We can go out and test it. And we can see that the evidence fits. And that's what I've been showing you. The evidence overwhelmingly fits. You know, when you look at evolution, it's a story about the past based on the words of men who weren't there. They're sinful creatures anyway. They don't have a time machine. They can't jump into the time machine and go back and have a look at it. Evolution is myth. It's a religion. It's a religious philosophy that is destroying our society. And if I can also put it to you this way, understanding all of this should make us realize God's the only one who knows everything. He has revealed to us in His Word the things that we need to know so that we can understand such things as biology and history and geology, so that we know what our ethics should be, so that we know how we should bring up our children and train our children. And the whole of society needs to be built upon that. Unfortunately, too many people, even in our churches, take the word of finite man who doesn't know everything, who hasn't always been there, who's a sinful creature anyway, and they try to understand the Bible in the light of what man says, as well as understanding everything else. And we see the whole of society collapsing around us. And the only thing that really is helping it to be propped up at all is a little bit of the influence that the church is having. But unfortunately, that's going to collapse totally unless we can get back to building the whole of society on that basis. And I want to leave you with the thought here. And I don't want to get into talking about your eschatological views and so on, except to say this. I'm very disappointed in a lot of people who, particularly because of the typical Hal Lindsey type philosophy, say, it's all going to get worse and worse anyway, so what's the point? We don't have to do anything. Why bother? Okay, it's all very well, but don't you understand what we're saying? If you grasp what Christianity is all about, it is the basis for rebuilding the whole of society and to have a total Christian philosophy. We can rebuild the nation of Australia, starting the basis in God's Word. Now, I don't care whether you're pre-mill, pan-mill, A-mill, windmill, or whatever. The point is, you know, as far as pre-mill is concerned, if you like, we could be at this place in Earth's history where we can rebuild things again that might go down again, or we could be on that sine curve. If for those who believe in post-mill, they believe that the whole world is going to be filled with the message of Christianity and totally reconstructed. I know that the Lord commands me to preach the gospel and commands me to do something as a Christian. And too many of us have this sort of backdoor cop-out, I just hope the rapture comes soon and gets me out of it. Whereas I believe what we should be doing is saying we need to be out there proclaiming this message. We can rebuild the nation of Australia. As Christians, even though we're a minority, we're a majority because God is on our side. And we have the truth, we know what it is, we know the basis on which man can live in this society, we know the basis for our morals, for our ethics, we know the right way to build education and biology and history and geology and everything else. We know that humanism is totally bankrupt. Look what's happening in Australia. The economy's going down, morally we're going down, spiritually everything's collapsing. Humanism is bankrupt, it is showing up in our nation. We're at a stage where people are saying, what's happening? What are the answers? Bob Hawke doesn't have the answers. In fact, the Liberals don't have the answers. The Labors doesn't have the answers. Christians have the answer. And the answer is to get back to God's Word and to rebuild our government, to rebuild our nation, to rebuild society on that basis, and we can see this nation turned around for the Lord. And so what I say is, regardless of what you believe in your eschatology, about what you believe concerning end times, let's realise that we have a tremendous message, and it is a message that can rebuild society, because I don't want to see the millions out there lost. I don't want to see them going to a Christless eternity. It's all very well for us that are Christians. We can go along to church and we can have our great times and so on, but what about the lost? Do you have a burden for how many million people in Australia? 15 million people, less than 5% attend church, as I understand it, and you can imagine what percent therefore are actually born-again Christians. Do you have a burden for those 15 million people out there who are going to a Christless eternity? Let's turn Australia around for the Lord. If we want to see revival, and we do, we have to build it from the foundation up. Too many people, I think, want to see revival starting up at this level, rather than realising we have got to rebuild the foundations so that it can stand. And that's where I see the creation ministry as a very unique ministry. We're not dealing at one of these levels up here. We're right down at the bedrock, the very foundation. And until we get the foundations of our belief set, then the structure can't be built. To build a structure, we've got to get the basis right, and of course we've got to get right back to the book of Genesis, which is foundational to the rest of what Christianity is all about, and the rest of that to stand upon there. And that's the message we've got for the world. And in the last lecture which I give today, because Dr. Gary Parker is going to give the next couple, I'm going to talk about creation evangelism, how we can use creation in evangelism in today's world, and that'll be the final lecture today.
For additional information, including a free catalog of creation materials, contact the Institute for Creation Research. Write to Post Office Box 2667, El Cajon, California, 92021, or call 619-448-0900.